I want to try to highlight that questions of value don't have to be economic questions, right? We can decide together that they are political questions with political solutions, but there's a downside to that, right? They can be questions about politics, but if they are, there isn't one right answer. And there probably isn't going to be a solution that favors all parties equally, right? And so I gave some of these folks, I'm excluding Lise because she had to talk for ages earlier, so she doesn't have to do this, but I gave all of us an assignment, and it was really about giving myself an assignment. And my assignment was, act like this is politics and you're a politician, and give us a 1-2 minute position statement, right? And part of the reason I did this is because I am completely resistant to doing this. There is a reason that I spend a lot of my time now thinking about how you can juggle two things in your head at the same time and keep working in the world. And so I tried to come to a place where I would say, I have a position regarding remuneration in the arts. And I'm going to talk for a minute, and we're all going to talk for a minute, and then we're just going to open this up. We're going to talk to each other, y'all are going to talk to us, let's do this. So here's my position. When an institution asks you to do something, you should get paid. And I used to be really flexible about this. We have all done a lot of work for free, right? And sometimes we've done that work for free for like big institutions that could have paid us. And there's always a good reason to do it for free, right? In my life there is. And I've become less and less flexible on this because we all want to support art institutions. We all actually pretty much understand their budgetary constraints. We all understand that they kind of have no money. And we've all been willing to sacrifice our own incomes for the good of the institution, for the good of the project, for the good of the community, right? I've done it, we all have. But I think we have to stop. I think we have to make demands. We have to acknowledge that we don't only work for ourselves, right? When we work with institutions, we work for them as well. So they show our work to funders when they talk about their work. They show our work to the state when they say that they are working for the common good, right? So if I was going to be more specific, I would say, if an organization has any paid employees, then artists need to be paid as well. And so you'll notice I don't say salaried employees. I don't think this only holds for large permanent institutions, but if a little group of friends gets a grant and 10% of that goes to one of them for administrative fees and 20% goes to one of them as a curator sort of fee, then they're getting paid, and so should you. There's a lot of caveats, there's a lot of specifics, but in short, I think that this little position statement boils down pretty simply. When you do work for an institution, you should get paid for it. There's a backside to this coin. I don't think being paid to be an artist, simply to be, is particularly appropriate or desirable in most cases. And I think there are real problems with accepting payment as a gift, as a stipend, as a prize. And I say this with full knowledge, including personal experience, of how important prizes and fellowships and things like that are in the arts, and how closely those sorts of gifts come to what we think of as getting paid to be an artist. But I think that focusing on payment for the work that we do in service of institutions, it's more likely to lead to greater income equality among artists. It's likely to normalize artists' work vis-a-vis everybody else's work, especially regarding sort of the relationship of income and state bureaucracies, things like taxes, Social Security, pensions. Pensions aren't really an issue here, but you know. And I think that normalizing our work is a really important part of claiming sort of full citizenship and full political agency as artists. That is all. So, disagree with me, someone, or agree.
In our position.
So, Helena, and can you introduce yourself real quick when you just say your name and what's up?
So my name is Helena Keeffe. I primarily identify as an artist, and I am maybe even less practiced at creating positions than you just did a dissertation. It's like a position, so following that...
it's not a position, it's real.
So I guess I'll just try to make a few points that will hopefully lead somewhere. I read recently that acupuncturists or Chinese practitioners of Chinese medicine at some point, actually, they were paid to treat you to prevent you from becoming sick. But once you became sick, they treated you for no charge. And just thinking about that, really, I mean, if you think about, if any of you have experienced Chinese medicine, it's very preventative care focused, and you think about like, how did that practice of medicine develop? It makes a lot of sense that at some point that was the model. And I think for me, like with things like that I developed here, like this request for funders where I'm flipping their request for qualifications that an artist would normally fill out and ask like a funder, like, okay, you want to fund this project, you think it's interesting, give us your qualifications, what have you funded in the past, what are your funding sources, like, so I can make sure that there's no ethical conflicts, you know, so these kinds of ways of just flipping the habitual thinking are what I'm interested in, and examples can be so powerful, even just the fact that Lise being in Berkeley and talking about wage certification led to very directly Jenny taking steps to talk about increasing the fees paid here, and this whole thing happening, and this idea expanding. And so it means no small thing, you know, the wage certification is a big project, but just that 1 hour with someone sharing their ideas could have this ripple effect. Also, I just mentioned, like, my parents, when I was 3, we moved to a commune where we took a vow of poverty. And so I've been thinking a lot about how that early experience led to my sort of interest in these economic issues for artists. And in a way, I grew up thinking, like, my parents took this big risk, and in a way it failed because we only lived there for 3 years. It still exists, but in a different economic form. But you know, this the idealism and the reality that sometimes clash for artists was also the case there. And I think I grew up thinking, if I just work really hard, like maybe like the artists who I hear about who struggle so much, they just didn't like work hard enough, or they weren't smart enough, you know. And so, you know, after 12 years of getting some significant grants, I've received, you know, $30,000, $40,000 for a project. I have received external validation. I have an MFA, and yet it's still, after 12 years of some success, really hard to imagine a sustainable future as an artist. So, in all this work I've been doing, for me, it's right now boiling down to maybe 2 things. Like one, advocacy, well, they're both maybe in the field of advocacy. Reaching out beyond art circles to try to, sort of figure out where these resources can come from. And it's not pandering, but conversations with people who don't understand what we're doing. And I think as artists, we don't do that enough. But then also this idea of art supporting the arts. And if I have like 30 more seconds, I'll just quickly read this Lewis Hyde quote from his book, The Gift. He talks about, so he says, initiated shortly after the Second World War, the Musicians Union worked out an innovative agreement with the recording companies such that a small percentage of the sale of each recording would go into a trust fund. After half a century, this institution, the Music Performance Fund, still distributes millions of dollars annually and supports thousands of concerts in the United States and Canada. It's the largest sponsor of live admission-free music in the world. Artists need not always go begging to taxpayers and private patrons. The arts themselves produce wealth, and therefore, if we have the wit or power to organize the needed institutions, the arts ought to be able to support the arts. In the United States, the Arts Endowment and the Arts Act was, in fact, the name given to a legislative proposal that, had it been realized, would have nicely reproduced the structure of the Music Performance Fund. So I think that's another thing that a lot of people are talking about right now that's important to put energy behind.
Thanks.
So I'm Ayanna McCloud, and I'll just read you my position statement. My approach is a little poetic, so I'll just go ahead and read it. What happens when value lies in the exchanges we have? A possible shift beyond commodities. rethinking entrepreneurship in a more magical way, eating, embodying, and digesting the institution, the possibilities of micro-institutions or anti-institutions, anarchist institutions. How do we measure our value at this moment, at this place? What happens when we disappear? 1 by 1, 2, 3, 4, or when we become hollow? Beyond the micro, when value has been depleted on a systemic level in relation to all of those boxes: profession, class, race, gender, age, sexuality. And how do we infuse value back into ourselves, our relationships, our communities, ourselves? And what does that look like? Is money enough? Oh, that's fine.
I spoke to like one aspect of like a new value or old value system earlier, but then I had like another sort of set of ideas and that I was going to try to speak to here, but I'm not going to be very concise about it because I couldn't get to that. But I think that like in general, I have a problem with our culture and so I think that like I'm just much more interested in also just art in general, especially this kind of professionalization that we've kind of just in general been like skirting around a lot, and I'm just much more interested in a populist vision of cultural production where everyone is participating in what it is that is culture, and that there's not sort of these cultural professionals that are deemed to have more expertise in producing the parts of life that make it interesting. So that's like the general vision, and so I think, but then so part of that, like, I just think the whole process of distinction is destructive, and in terms of like if you're saying that distinction means more than your own personal taste, if you're trying to assert that taste beyond your own sphere, then it just becomes about power, and we don't need to necessarily assert power over each other. So in that way, I think that all valuing is just about finding a way to transfer culture into an economic language. And I can't really see it outside of that. And so it's just like when we create distinction, when we create value in terms of culture, then we're just making it an economic activity. And I think in general, it's more of an issue of like sort of for all of society and all of our culture that there's just not enough leisure to create culture, and that is the space where I find cultural production to be most interesting, rather than a professionalization and a sort of sort of a focus on an expert elite. Anyway, so that's my take. Thank you.
So we can talk to each other, but if anybody wants to jump in, we are also happy to just start talking as a room. So, for example, let's be pedagogical for a moment. I have a position that I came up with and I do stand behind. And yet, I feel an enormous affinity with Zach's position, which is not compatible with my position, right? Like it's the most incompatible of all of these. And in my own work, I spend a lot of time talking and thinking about these sort of like logical inconsistencies and how they can sort of constitute a field of practice. But at some point, like we sing that "Which side are you on?" song in our head, and we feel this need to take sides, especially if we want to get something done, right? And I think Lise was talking about how wage is myopic, right? And I remember, so I was at the Wage Summit, and I remember that we had just insane conversations like all day about like whether there should be a checkbox for like gender equity in an institution, right? We care about all these things. At the same time as we want to get some stuff done and make some stuff happen. And if anybody has any thoughts on how to reconcile that in a life, I'd like to hear it, because to me, my work is about reconciling that in theory, but that's very different from reconciling it in practice or on a daily basis.
I feel like that's a conversation that can be very paralyzing for political conversations. Like, are we going to settle for incremental progress and say, this is all we can do right now, and once we do this, we'll do something else, and once we do that, we'll do something else. And I know this is, for many people, myself included, a point of contention, because sometimes it feels like when we allow ourselves for that incremental progress, the people who are said, we'll help you later, you'll be the next round, or once we achieve this earmark or bright line, we'll help you next. Those are the groups of people or the individuals that are so frequently pushed to the margins and said that their stories don't matter, or that their priorities are less, or that this will come later. And so I do think it's a conversation that's interesting when we talk about race or gender or economic status. Are these conversations that we can push to the margins, even provisionally or even momentarily? But at the same time, you can't say like it's all or nothing. Like, we will go from our broken system to the perfect utopia tomorrow, and we will not take any concessions. So I think that that's an interesting question and an interesting balance that can paralyze a lot of political sort of people that are interested in actual political change. Have to sometimes make sacrifices for the sake of incrementality.
Yeah, incrementalism versus radicalism is like, in my heart, it is a huge tension.
Yeah, that's something that Wage, I felt like during Occupy, I was really active in Occupy in New York, and sort of as representing Wage. Well, I tried not to represent Wage, or no, what did I do? I did both. I can't remember, it's so crazy. That's how tired I am. But I do remember feeling like Wage was criticized, or there was some pushback about us being sort of reformists, and not radical enough, not asking for more. And so then since Occupy, just even in panel discussions or other contexts, I often, I get asked that question again, and my answer has finally developed an answer, which is that, this gets like kind of a fight, it's like a false dichotomy, like all of these things need to exist at the same time. Just because we're not taking on like the entire art world doesn't mean that someone else can't take on like the commercial sphere. We're dealing with the nonprofit sphere, or I'm like, I totally want like anarchists to keep like anarchizing. That can I introduce that word? I don't think that these things have to happen at the expense of one another. So that's the way I resolve those kinds of tensions. It would be crazy if we were the only people doing this one tiny thing. Nothing would ever change.
I'm intensely interested in the concept that you just brought up about leisure. I hesitate to use the word value, but the value of leisure. Leisure is a category that's carved out of work. It's the opposite term of work is. Leisure is where hobbies happen. But we have to fight for leisure because it's incumbent on us to work more and more and more and more unless we demand a weekend or unless we demand and I wonder how leisure might help us to consider all of these categories that may seem contradictory or difficult if we think of them in terms of like where is the leisure?
You mean leisure in the sense of like, I prefer not to, like the refusal or leisure in the sense of...
Leisure is categorically the opposite number of work. That's what it is. But it's also an essential part of our human, ability, and artwork and production of art is, it crosses that boundary.
Well, I think even that maybe relates also to sort of shifts in the cultural value of volunteering.
Right.
Like, whereas volunteering at some point might have been like because you want to help out in your neighborhood or your church or your local school or something, to shifting maybe to being like a stepping stone or a foot in the door to getting a job. I think that's related too to like less and less leisure time, so that someone feels like the little spare time they have has to be used to get a solid leg up or sort of advantage in their struggle to advance their career, versus feeling like it can be used in these other ways that aren't remunerated, you know, but are really important to like healthy communities and things like that. I don't know if that relates to your interest in it, but it's something I think about.
You just saying that is exhausting to me. I think you go home now and go to sleep.
Well, like we're all here on a Sunday too, right? Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I just finished a program at UC Berkeley, and Arts Research Center that we did this similar event with there normally has their events on like a Friday, because that's when a lot of faculty don't have classes and they're mostly catered to like faculty and grad students. And I had to really push for it to happen on a Saturday, because I was like, I want people from the community, I want artists who have like their full-time jobs and do their work on the weekends and evenings to be able to come to this thing that's really important. And it really shifted that, you know, they really noticed like how different their audience was on Saturday versus on Friday. But like the people who work in arts administration a lot of times are able to go to those things because they are able to do it as part of their paid job, right? It's considered part of their job sometimes to like attend these things. And maybe for artists that, you know, we're sort of talking about like getting into this world of artists being compensated more as professionals, maybe then that's more of a reality for the weekend to be left for leisure.
I just read this book that made my brain go all worried, weird, like a machine, not worried. But it was kind of fascinating. So I read this book last week by a guy named Roland Paulson. And like there's an article on it in the Atlantic this week, so you can also just read his article in the Atlantic, which is the whole argument. But it's this book, it's called Empty Labor, I think, and it's about like not working at work. And in a sense, it's almost like a how-to book in sections, even though it's like sociology. And there's this weird way that not working real hard at your job is conceptualized as leisure, as opposed to like leisure as leisure. And one of the things that you notice as you read, if you read closely the quotes, these people are not, they're not happy. Right? They're like on Facebook all day at work because they're at work and that's all they can do. They wouldn't be on Facebook if they were home. That's not how they would spend their genuine leisure time. And it was an interesting, I mean, it made me sort of rethink also like my framing, right? So when you were talking about leisure and non-professional work, that's the version where you actually take more time off work, of this like Paulson argument. Whereas my we should get paid when we work it's like a version of like I should get to not work that hard at my job, right? It's a sort of commitment to a system that has some pretty fatal problems that we live in, right? People find themselves in positions where they at least feel that they have to work very hard, they have to make a lot of cash income, you know?
As a lot of these arguments maybe can be reconciled if we did have a different political system in this country. You know, as what you were saying about these things can exist at the same time, that's the exact feeling that I had after the election. Like, don't not vote people, you vote and you do the other stuff, you know. It all has to happen.
Well, I didn't think that art could happen without leisure. I mean, I kind of would define, you know, what I write and stuff having to come out of something that's detached from what we'll call work.
Well, the idea of leisure was built out of having to take out of factory work. Right. So that's factory work as defining work, but then there's this other kind of work.
Well, how can you discover something, you know, like what the arts are trying to do, right? Be creative, liberate. How does that square with work? I'm thinking more in terms of technology and how it promised to like free us all up to sit around, 20 hours a day. We had to work 2 or 3 hours a day. Work, you know, okay, I'll let a couple things for 2 hours, you know. and then go do art, right? Is that in this room at all?
It's a nice utopia.
Is it all?
If you own the company that makes the robots.
So now we have Facebook, all like, yeah, that's awesome.
Also, I just wonder also about people using their leisure time to view art and the viewing of art as entertainment or as a leisure activity that doesn't involve work. Because I actually think that looking at art does involve work, not paid work. I don't mean labor, I'm not suggesting that people be paid to look at art, but just that art is increasingly becoming a kind of a, I think it is becoming a more populist activity and becoming more like entertainment, which I actually don't think it's a good thing necessarily. I mean, I think like all the sociologists, Hans Abing would argue that that is a good thing. It's the only way that art becoming more like entertainment is the only way to demystify the field so that people don't do stupid things like go into debt for $150,000 to want to be part of this incredibly elite industry. So if it becomes entertainment, then people are just like, oh, yeah, that's not so special. I mean, that's the like really base version of his argument. But actually, here's another kind of paradox of like art as entertainment or art as work. And I mean, it's like this idea of like if all we do is work with no, and that art doesn't have any value, the art isn't valued as something that should be supported, like all other industries, then all we're doing is working. And what are we doing with our leisure? What is the meaning of leisure without a way of reflecting on the meaning of work and the meaning of leisure? I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Isn't there something more than work or leisure?
What's that?
Isn't there something more than work or leisure?
We wish there were, probably.
Well, you
Yeah.
mentioned the Platonic elements earlier.
Right, but that's one opposition, and there's other oppositions.
You had the good and the beautiful, but you left out the true.
Yeah.
Right. The point being, and what I love about this conversation is it's full spectrum. But transcending and including that is the mystery, is what's missing, and which is intangible and yet still compels us in so many different ways. I can't really speak about it. And it's part of what Lewis Hyde mentioned in the book, Forget, when he's speaking about usury, when he's speaking about money, and lending money can actually generate more money. And this is something that was kept away in Western culture by Byzantium for 1,500 years. And even Clinton struck down the last of the usury laws. The point is, what should be monetized? What shouldn't? What cannot? And these are probably questions about human nature, about greed, and things like this, that really could be dealt with in a classical way and in a postmodern way when we're having a conversation like this. But of course, it's a different kind of conversation at that point. Okay.
I think I'm with you a lot, Nestor, but I think the only sort of reason to bring up leisure is just about that we just don't, it was some sort of idea about where the culture that I value the most, seems what kind of realm
I love it.
activity.
Yeah.
But then I think that just the professionalization project or this sort of bringing into your practice, which you have defined as work and labor, which is to a lot of, to me, to a large extent, makes a lot of sense, but then it's just, it really is giving up on the project of not being and defining yourself as a economic person. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's that's my problem with the sort of we can have it all, we can do incremental stuff, but it's because it's you either have to resist defining yourself economically, or you have to I maybe I'm wrong, but I just it seems to me that it's either does that make sense? I mean, I didn't finish the thought, but it's just it's either you're trying to work to resist it, or you're trying to work to make that work for you better. And I don't think how you can do those at the same time.
Why is it opposition?
They're not mutually exclusive. You get paid, and then take whatever you want.
Yeah, but I think if you're forced to define all of your thoughts and activities as a sort of in an economic framework, rather than sort of just a you know,
But I just think doing the opposite is sort of pretending that the economic framework doesn't exist, you know, and you do yourself a disservice by doing that. I think that's really not advisable. I mean, I don't know. I don't think it has to be like a totality where just because you place a price or a value on the labor that you have sold or expended in contact with the institution, it doesn't mean that you have monetized your entire being. You know, it's not. I don't think it's one or the other.
Well, I mean, it's not that like I don't think that we should like demand to get paid. So what I said earlier is like I don't think that like. Mainly because I don't think that we should allow ourselves to be exploited. But I don't think that we should then sort of like willingly accept the definitions that maybe because there's another idea where you're like I want to looking at art as work, but maybe it's like difficult and maybe it takes thinking. But if we sort of just like work, to me maybe it's like too narrow of a definition. It's just like
it's
sort
too
of
broad.
What?
Or it's like it's too narrow and too broad of a definition.
Yeah, but it's just like
I meant difficult, I think.
Okay, and I'm just saying then I just don't want to take everything I do and have to define it as work, because then that to me is just by definition is like some sort of economic activity. That's all I was saying. Like I demand to be paid all the time, but I'm not like. But then I'm like not trying to also demand to be and all these other sort of things that we are told need to come with it. We don't have to bring with it. We can just be like, I need to get paid because you're getting paid.
Yeah, it doesn't.
But I'm not going to be as professional as you are because you have a job and I'm just like myself doing this thing. All these you can like. I'm not like.
So
I'm not trying.
I have a question that's sort of along that line, sort of along this whole conversation of wage and what have you. So, I mean, most of us here are creative people and have started our endeavors out, and all of us have struggled with doing things for what we want to do and not getting paid. But so I guess I'll go through a little scenario, which leads to a question. But so like, what's the stance? And so like, working towards something for the greater good. So Zach has this project, the shrimping thing, and he has a residency that is just about learning. So I mean, I've participated in it, and you essentially were able to work a little bit before and a little after, but you're actually just shrimping the whole time. You're learning an experience, but he's creating new dialogue, and so like alternative spaces too, starting up by artists mostly, that then sort of go, because they're figuring out these sort of like secret doors into the art world and new opportunities. I mean, it's how I got started as a curator and a nonprofit person, is starting up a space because I thought, I'm finding out about this thing and I'll just share it with these other people. So in the beginning, it's about offering up this space or an environment for artists to create. There's no, I'm still not getting paid. And so like, it's more about then valuing sort of my time or my own money that I put into this project to keep these doors open so that these artists can work. And, from that we've been able to get grants, and as we get grants, we give out money. And, sometimes in the beginning, we just started a residency program where we just paid out of pocket to fly someone to hang out with us for a month and be involved in the community and all that. So and then the wage calculator too. So like it doesn't necessarily account for that. And I'm glad that you said that sort of under 100,000 sort of like doesn't apply. But
well, don't quote me on that.
I'm just saying, and that I'm glad that such a calculator exists. But I do see a lot of black and white, this side or that side. Either you're paying or you're not paying. Or I feel like in some of the conversations that I've been involved with this weekend, it sort of leaves out some of the gray area. So with Dawn, it was about if your project's not working, then know if you need to quit or not. But then with the Chances presentation, they've been doing it for 10 years, and it's all about building this community and like really putting everything they have, their energy into it, and trying to make it work as best they can. But I think they're still not pulling in salaries, and they get maybe a little bit of money, and they basically give as much as they can as they get. And the same with microgrants and Sunday soup and that sort of thing being started as a way to like give money that just didn't exist before, whether it be $200 or $500, that didn't exist, and now it does, and they're trying to get that. So just thoughts on that.
Well, that was your political position. That idea, that was actually we discussed that at the summit. That was actually the basis for deciding that the difference between artist-run spaces and nonprofits is that if a nonprofit has a paid staff, that's the imperative for having to pay artists in that context. So there is a difference in those two things, but I don't think that expecting a nonprofit to pay fees to artists or pay artists for their services or whatever in any way like cancels out the value of projects that are sort of like predicated on sharing or bartering or I don't know. I just think this is like a false dichotomy. Like I just feel like this is the same thing that keeps coming up. But also like this idea of gauging the gray area. Like there is, and this is, I think what's so interesting about this whole weekend has been, especially I could only see it today during all the presentations and sort of seeing it all come together. And I think it came together a lot in your presentations that there's like, there's a time to say yes, there's time to say no, and then there's time for everything in between. And that these like the yes and no don't cancel each other out. I just think it's the way we're thinking about it that is kind of the problem. And then I'm sure that is because of living under like neoliberal capitalism. Like this is the way. These are the dichotomies that are set up for us. They're like traps. That we're sort of like. I guess that's what I meant by that irresolvable contradictions thing that I presented. It's just that. We find ourselves kind of like just going around in circles in these arguments. And in the meantime, we're exhausting ourselves and not paying ourselves and exploiting each other. Like that's the thing that I find actually with wage that I experienced this firsthand is that I am so tired because I'm constantly doing things for free. And I think maybe like all of the panic and stuff that's come that like maybe it's that you sense from wage, it's coming from like this experience of New York because it's so pressurized and people are constantly asking. They're constantly asking you for content or services, and of course I want to give it for free because I think it's important. But in the end, I find myself like it creates so much work for me. And in fact, I'm sorry, I'm just like rambling now, but I just wanted to give this anecdote about creative time. I don't know if you guys were aware of that Suzanne Lacey project that they did. I can't remember what it was called.
Out in the streets or into the streets.
Yeah, it was an artist named Suzanne Lacey.
It was on Stoops.
Yeah, Stoops.
It was always like conversations among activists.
And primarily women activists.
Yeah.
So it involved hundreds of people. And a friend of mine from Occupy took issue with it. It was also, they didn't provide daycare. There are a lot of like OWS issues, meaty issues that they could dig into, but I thought it was a really important point. The point was no one was getting paid. Suzanne Lacey was getting big fee. So my friend reached out to me and Wage and said, we signed this petition, and we said, definitely. And so we also wrote to Nato Thompson, who's been a big supporter of Wage, but again, like this is the tension that we're always trying to maintain is to work to create an environment of mutual respect between artist and institution, but have enough of a critical distance that we can continue to be critical of them at the same time, which is tough. So we were critical of this, and we stood with other people in criticizing creative time, and he, was like not happy with that at all. But it started to make me think. So other people that I knew. I was in conversation with others. I'd been asked to do another panel for free, not about wage, and I said no. It was Skowhegan. I was just like, no. I looked up their $9.90. Looked up their budget. I talked to the director on the phone because she did that, and I said, there's absolutely no way I'm going to do this for free. I can't. In good conscience do this for free. And so another friend of mine said, but why? I can't believe you would say no. Like, this is my activism. Like, I wouldn't charge money. I wouldn't. I do activism because I love it. And I was like, that sounds really familiar.
Yeah.
That sounds really familiar to me. So this is where this really strange nexus, again, between activism, to me, is like kind of like the new frontier of like exploitation of like activist labor is like another frontier of that. And that's what I experienced directly with wage. I know, I'm just like, you get tired after a while, and then you have no leisure.
Yeah.
You know? The more you get paid, the more leisure you should have. It's like,
Yeah.
anyway.
This is, real quick, this was kind of one of the interesting things that came out of the Suzanne Lise conversation around that piece, because a lot of it really hinged on whether the participants were being called volunteers or performers. And I think like that language kind of ended up changing, like in the presentation of the performance, or of the performance, of the piece, right? So like if people had signed on as volunteers, of course, they wouldn't expect to get paid, but, you know, doing the exact same act if they were there as performers, they would expect to get paid. And it was the same kind of language of like, you know, we are here like enabling these networks to be formed between activists, and therefore like we're the ones, creative time, giving you the platform, and that's your form.
Yeah, that's your payment. Exactly.
Yeah, it was really
Exactly.
interesting. Yeah. Sorry.
I think just, sorry, but just to go back to like work or jobs, if we talk about it in that way, what I think is interesting is like maybe we just need a much more narrow definition of work. Because it's like, you know, if it's a job, I don't know, that's like that's my issue with like a lot of this stuff, is that you're asked to do things by people who have jobs, and you're sort of like an independent economic entity that's like doing all this kind of stuff and piecing together a livelihood. And then, and I, you know, I had a job for like a really long time.
You have none?
Not that I can go somewhere and like collect a paycheck. Like I'd like had to like make my paycheck for 13 years.
From getting grants to support your work, or?
Yeah, or shrimping.
Right.
But that's a job though. I mean, I think it's actually the language.
It's not, but it's like
But-
it's not a job.
But the thing about it is that, so like, it's sort of, but the thing about it is, so what is a job? And like.
Well, that was what I was trying to say. Is like I just think there's somewhat a difference between at least like how I think a lot about that stuff, and sort of the difference between like, let's say like a curator and an artist and like that. I talked to my sort of talk about like how. No, I guess I think like the small family or like the nonprofit sort of green educational farms are sort of insidious and like cynical, because they're sort of participating in the market and outcompeting, outcompeting sort of people trying to make a go at like reinvigorating the small family farm, and because they can cover their costs through philanthropy, and those people all have jobs. In my maybe not, but like they get this. Like you end up like.
But if they raise money through a grant, that's exactly like an artist raising money through a grant. It's not different. I don't.
Yeah. No, I mean you're right.
But you're saying
they have a
participating
job
in the same market as people who have different.
Yeah, I think that issue is different though, because like what you're talking about is
Circumstances.
it's an issue because we need, whatever, we don't need. We can all survive on robot food, but like, but we want small family farms, right? And if our goal is to have small family farms, then yes, these guys are like the worst because they're screwing it up for everybody.
Yeah.
They all need to be nonprofits or not, but like this mix doesn't work, and that's totally true. But I think that's different than the question of having a job.
You're right. I conflated the two. I just like got excited. You're right. Yeah. It's more nuanced than that, yes. And I think
But I also am like really resistant to sort of the occupationalization of art practice, right? I think it's mostly bad for most people. But it does make a lot of practices possible that can't exist another way. And because those kinds of practices I think are very elite right now, those really dominate the conversation in a way it's not good for the kind of art that I personally care about for the most part.
But I think that what that little moment right here where you were just trying to like figure out like, well, I do have a job, or no, I don't have a job, but you know, just that whole moment of like uncertainty is really interesting, because it's really about, well, how do artists package themselves, or how do we define ourselves, and the services that we offer. And so maybe we don't, I feel like as soon as you offer services, or if maybe you don't have the kind of a typical job, but you do offer a service, and you have these multiple jobs and these small jobs. And so I'm actually really interested in the artist as an entrepreneur. Like, we offer services. Why not embrace that and kind of stand in that and say, you know, what I do benefits you, and I expect this back, and just kind of reclaim that space and like stand very confidently in that space. I too don't know kind of like how to name it too, but I always kind of hold on to this idea of artist as entrepreneur, because there's so many things that we have to kind of think about our inventory, we have to think about our services, we have different, audiences that we have to serve. So I'm really interested in kind of stepping into it and quantifying, like for example, when you were talking about the artists who got audited, and that whole issue of like hobbyist versus an artist, and it made me think, well, how am I kind of like quantifying what I do, documenting what I do, categorizing what I do, it's really, actually I think it's really essential for your sustainability to frame that as kind of, as a profession, as a job, so I'm actually like, I feel to stand very firmly in it.
So one thing that I'm working on now that this is touching on and maybe helping me think through is that so I'm looking at all 1,500 oral histories from artists who were born between 1880 and 1970. Okay, so come on up. So one thing that I'm noticing is that in the 60s, late 60s, and in the 70s, the idea of art as entrepreneurial activity falls out of favor, right? It becomes kind of dirty to talk about money. It's kind of classless to have like a cash box. Like you start to see this set of conversations at the same time as this professionalism and job language starts to emerge. And I think late 60s, early 70s, I think. And what I think is going on is like we're so uncomfortable with being capitalists that what we try to replace it with is professionalism, right? We're doing entrepreneurial work very often, but being entrepreneurial has a sort of dirty sheen nowadays because we're all very critical of the economy, right? We're all very critical of capitalism, and I think calling yourself a professional allows you to sort of remove yourself, right? Classically speaking, professionals don't get paid directly for their services. They don't bill for the thing they did. They bill for their time and their skills and their expertise, right? And that's like, it's a way of distancing ourselves, I think, from what we think of as like filthy lucre, right? This cash box image that we all think, oh, we're really well educated, we shouldn't have a cash box. But I think embracing sort of entrepreneurialism in the arts is a very honest way forward. And the things we do don't actually look so different from the things artists did in the 60s, the things artists did in the 30s. We talk about it very differently though, and I think we think about it very differently.
It's more like at bottom talking about, I mean, no Marxist scholar, but like alienated labor versus unalienated labor, and like.
Yeah, but it's so like, I don't know. I don't think the division between professionalism and entrepreneurialism has anything to do with alienation. Like,
No, not
in the way that it plays out. But in our imagination, it's a big difference.
But just in terms of like not thinking of art as a job, and like you said, it's not a job. Wait a minute, it's not a job. It's like because you're not alienated from your own labor, and so therefore it doesn't fit into this kind of.
Yeah, and I guess profession, like, again, embraces some kind of, like, non-alienation.
If we could find a caste system in this country, how would you define it?
I think just real quick, sorry, just like something about issue like risk and security. And I think that was like sort of, there would be some sort of spectrum.
Yeah.
That, like, I think that like, you just end up interacting with people that have more security and taking less risk.
For sure, it's much more white collar to be a professional than to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and then just like the idea that you can.
Even if the everyday of your own life is just as risky.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions. Sorry, you guys. Just yell from here on out, okay?
I feel like the sort of schizophrenic workaround that we talked about at various times in our life is separating the sort of conceptual, self-visioning version of artists from the job of arts making. You know, the framing, the archiving, the fabrication, the installation, the shipping, the moving, the handling, the hanging. And accepting that the professional realm of that deserves a fair amount of recompense, and that potentially the conceptual world of that has no viable relationship with remuneration, which is a little bit of a rhetorical game, but at the same time, it's kind of a working personal logic, which you've spoken to in various ways. But
I think there's a tendency to avoid the professionalism because it also comes with an intrinsic failure for most people. So if you're a professional artist and you don't make a living, then you're a fucking failure. Nobody wants that anymore. So if you could just avoid that and have a job over here, and then your real life, your congruent self over here, well, that feels a lot better, doesn't it? You know? But it's a better thing.
I recently had somebody, I get this all the time, that hobby thing, like a guy came to my studio to fix the heater the other day and he's like, so you do, is this what you do for your work? And I was like, no, I mean, it's the most important thing for me, but no, I don't get paid for it. He's like, so it's a hobby, right? And I was just like, oh God. And then I just was like, yeah, I guess it is. What, maybe that's not bad, like, I was just like, maybe that's fine. Why is that, maybe a hobby is great, you know? I just realized it might have actually just been my own, you know, relationship with the word that was the problem.
You talked before about, and maybe I misunderstood, you're talking about like prizes being kind of dangerous to your concept, or, you know, and I come from the poetry world where prizes are, that's it. You're not making any money from books, you're not making any money from anything. So, prizes are really the only, prizes in teaching, and if you want to make sure, prizes are really it. So, kind of, can you talk a little bit more about that?
So I say this as someone who has, at times, relied entirely on prizes and fellowships for my income as like a self-supporting person, right? So I totally understand how important they are, and that in some fields, like, including like social practice, right, stuff that I care about, prizes, which covers a whole lot of things that are not wages or salaries, are the only money, the only option, right? That said, so the biggest prize I ever got was a year's salary when I lived in Sweden from the state. It's a year's salary, it's prorated in a particular way, it's my salary. It's a pile of money that you get, and it's not a prize. It's intended to support 1 year of work. But it's a stipend, right? So it doesn't count toward, I couldn't get childcare for my son because I didn't have a job, right? And childcare is free for everyone in Sweden, or actually there's a payment scale, but it's free basically compared to here. Right, but I couldn't have it because I didn't have a job, because what I got was a prize. It wasn't a salary, it wasn't a wage. Now I am a PhD student because I'm at a private university and not a public university. I'm in a union that can't be recognized, and it might never be recognized. The university doesn't have to recognize it because it's a private university. I am paid a stipend, not a wage, no matter how many hours I work teaching. That's not taxable, except it is, and I have to pay taxes on it. So these monies, they count for some things and not for other things. And I think that that's actually a huge problem for issues of citizenship and political agency. I think that poets should get the same prizes that they do, but they should be reclassified. And you might have to pay a bit more taxes on it, right? Unless you're willing to do a Schedule C and use your,
Most of them fall beyond, below the poverty line anyway.
Right. I mean, like this issue of paying taxes on your money is like, it's kind of moot for most of us, most of the time, right? I do understand that those are issues, but I think my position, if I have a position, I'm really reluctant to take positions, but I do think it's important politically for those monies to be converted to wages or salaries, to be converted to the same kind of money that other people make, just in order that we might have the rights of political participation in the ways that other people who get money for the stuff that they do have access to political participation through that money, right? And I think, there's a lot of examples, and I've had a lot of those examples in my own life, but I think that gives you the sense of what I mean by I don't think prizes are the answer.
Yeah. And actually, you actually reminded me talking about the difference between like the like, you know, more conceptual academic part of being an artist and the more like hammer nails part, and like one is categorically kind of paid for, can be paid for and charged for, whatever, and then the other can't be, or isn't, or is kept clean and pure of a wage. When, you know, especially something like poetry, like, it's like,
Right. But an
you know,
example,
paying for poetry is just like so weird.
right.
Like a theory of relativity, I mean, you know, that's, nothing's clear, or the discovery of penicillin, or, you know, like.
But like an example of this conversion is pretty simple, right? So in Sweden again, there's a group called Ikokoa. They're like an upstart artist union in competition with the legitimate and old artist union. And one of the things they fought for was that when you get paid, the form of that pay should be salary for 2 months' work. No matter what the rate is, no matter how low it is. But they were trying to get recognition from institutions that when you have a solo exhibition, say, there is a lot of time involved in that, and the money that you get paid should bring you into the social system, right? And that was a successful campaign to some extent. So after a few years of them arguing that, there were some art funds for artists that were converted to, on paper, 2 months' salary. Even though there wasn't more or less money, but it changed everything for these artists, right? And I think that that's important and kind of worth working towards, just because of what it allows you.
I'm curious if anyone knows of a model where, I mean, if an artist registered their studio as a business, and whatever funds they get, and that income can be part of this business.
Yep.
I mean, is that how it's, I mean, I have
how a lot
a
of
very,
self-employed
very modest practice, so I don't know about this. So
Yep.
is that the way, is that a model for,
That's the way a lot of self-employed people do.
Right.
They call themselves, I mean, technically then you call yourself a small business.
okay.
And that really changes how people think about things and even do things.
So for me, the solution is why not all artists register as, you know, as register their studio, their name and their studio as a business and become like also
a sole proprietor.
a sole proprietor.
Yeah.
That seems like the solution.
That we talked about earlier, Dan Allen, who have their exhibition here, they're incorporated as how to work projects. So after all the money we raised for the POW, all the money we gave them and all that, and then they raised, it all came and it goes into they're incorporated.
Right.
And they didn't incorporate it as a 501c3, they just incorporated.
Right.
So then they're able to sort of do their tax forms and put
Yeah.
it out, and put material there.
Right,
Then their wage, which is always tiny, they're not taxed on, except for the little amount that they
Right,
make.
right.
Not everything.
Right. See, that is a really, like, I just feel like that, we should be kind of taught that, you know, in art school, or not, you know, just that you make art, but you, how to, you know, this, again, going back to this idea of artist as entrepreneur, and like, you know, to actually register your business, and, you know, I think that's probably the best solution to
We were talking about in Canada.
A lot of that.
You taught that,
before.
yeah.
Like,
Wow.
Fresh Arts, Fresh Arts, like, that's a big part of our mission, is to help artists do exactly that. And Texas Accounting
Learn how to do
the
these
arts
things.
will help you do that. You just have to get them in advance. And there's lots of ways to do that, and it really does work.
So because we ended on a positive note there, like, look, there's this thing that exists. This is great. I'm getting a wrap-up signal. So I feel like we're all here and we can all talk if we want to, but we should stop sitting up here and go out there, and you all should go out there. So let's say thank you to all these guys.